All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Mahiluk. My ancestral name is Kirby Hapwalaksa. My English name is Kirby Muldo. I am from the Gitxsan and Tsimshian nations. I come to you today from the Gitxsan territory, the unceded, unsurrendered, and unceded territory of the Gitxsan. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I hope everybody's safe and healthy. I hope you had a chance to read over the short bios that we sent out about the presenters and the hosts. We've got a wonderful panel today. So I would like to introduce Nikki Skoos, who will be helping me moderate the webinar today.
Thanks, Kirby, and welcome everyone. I'm coming from the Gidimt'en House of the Wet'suwet'en Nation here in Smithers, and I work for a small initiative called Northern Confluence, and I'm happy to join Kirby to co-host this. And really, I've been curious about impact benefit agreements. IBA will be the acronym of the day, and for a long time, and have had varying from talking to high government officials or hearing from industry that these agreements mean consent, to hearing from First Nations allies and seeing some research done that shows that that isn't always the case. So I thought it would be good to dig a little deeper and learn more. And so I'm really excited by the three panelists who have agreed to join us. So we're going to start off hearing from each of the presenters for about 15-20 minutes, and then we're going to jump into a question and answer, a sort of moderated discussion with all the panelists. So during the time of the presentations, if you would like to go down, there's a Q&A button, and so you can use that in order to ask questions that Kirby and I will be reviewing as this goes by, and hopefully get a chance to get most of your questions answered. So without further ado, we're going to turn it over to Jacob Beaton, who's an Indigenous engagement and an expert in Indigenous engagement and informed consent, and has had consulting businesses for a number of years. So he is going to provide us with an overview.
Thank you, Nikki. Good to see you, and good to see everybody on the call here with us today. As Nikki mentioned, my name is Jacob Beaton. My tribal name is Japusgatwinskik. I'm Laxkik, which is Eagle Clan, from Kitkatla originally. Also have ancestry in Haida Gwaii, Bella Bella, Heiltsuk, and Lac Balams. And I'm currently living in Gitxsan territory on a farm, which I absolutely love. As mentioned, I did have a career where I had my own businesses. My first company was called Copper Moon Communications, and we focused on initially graphic design, but we got pulled in as an Indigenous person and as an Indigenous company. We started to get asked to participate in community engagement projects that tended to be around quite controversial projects, and we were always hired by First Nations. So fairly early on, I started trying to solve this problem of what we now call free, prior, informed consent, but it wasn't called that back then. It was just, how do we get to a conflict-free decision on some difficult questions? So I did develop a system and a formula. We did that for a few years, and I'm currently mostly working in the negotiation field, deal structuring, and negotiating on behalf of First Nations, which I actually really enjoy. There's a lot of great stuff about it. I also come across a lot of agreements that have been negotiated, different types of agreements, and get to see sort of what's going on out there. So part of my role in our conversation this morning is just to give sort of a 101 on First Nations agreements, how they're made, what types of agreements they are, and just sort of a very high level overview. So if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, that's what I'm going to do. And then I'm looking forward to your questions later on. So the first thing, I actually sketched some things out here. First thing I'm going to talk about is just title, and the fact that there are two kind of main concepts of title that we run into. The first one is the mainstream one that we work in. You know, my wife and I, we own a farm, and because we're married, the title is in both our names. Okay, so that's the this concept of individual title. Our children have no title, technically or legally. A lot of agreements, you know, especially when they're coming from government and industry, they still take a very much an individualistic title approach, where they go and they approach a chief and they just want the chief to sign in order to ratify an agreement. That's the individual title approach. Collective title, well, that's the Indigenous viewpoint, then that's the traditional viewpoint. So you have beliefs like the 7 generations. We're making decisions now for 7 generations. That whole idea is this collective idea that's expanded beyond our current year and current generation into this idea that actually future generations have title on what we have today, which is a very deep and powerful concept that isn't very well understood, I find. And it's not understood on a number of levels. So let's jump into, and I think the concept of collective title will come up in our discussion a fair bit. Okay, but I wanted to also mention before I move on that collective title is something that has been established now in court decisions over and over again. So it's a legal jurisprudence that exists in our country now. Okay, next slide here are the types of agreements. So one thing I just wanted to impress is that there's a lot of acronyms that you hear. So we've got IBA, Impact Benefit Agreement, MBA. So industry and government really don't like the word impact. They'd love to get rid of it. So they started trying to replace it with mutual. So mutual benefit agreement instead of impact benefit agreement. The province did a number of agreements with First Nations that they called PBAs, which is Pipeline Benefit Agreement. So there's any number of acronyms that are just invented. They're not really hard and fast rules. You don't even necessarily have to use them. You can make up your own acronyms when you're a negotiator. So for example, I ran into a negotiator who was doing a CIBA, a Cultural Impact Benefit Agreement. And then on the industry side, we've got partnerships and joint ventures, which I'll touch on, I think, in the next slide here. So the main takeaway for me is that just because there's an acronym doesn't mean you have to use it. Just because there's a formula doesn't mean you have to use it. I mean, the wonderful thing about negotiation nowadays is there's a lot of room for flexibility and for definition of how you want, as a First Nation, how you want to move forward, how you want to be seen by the world, and how you want to interact with different parties out there. So the next slide here, and this is kind of an important one on the technical side, that there are this concept in our colonial Canada of areas of jurisdiction, and it can be very, very frustrating for a lot of people to try and work within this. So the first one is federal jurisdiction. So the reason I'm mentioning this is if you're dealing with the province and you want to talk about salmon in the ocean, they won't talk to you about it. You have to go talk to the federal government. They won't even have a conversation. So on the federal side, we've got things like salmon in the ocean. That's a federal issue. Marine safety, for example, is federal. Health on reserve, anything on reserve is going to be federal, a federal party and system that you have to deal with. On the provincial side, kind of a hard line in between, you've got things like trees, for example, forestry is all going to be provincial. The freshwaters, creeks, rivers, lakes are going to be provincial. And interestingly enough, a lot of the off-reserve sort of benefits that you'll see in agreements will come from the province, mostly because the federal government will say, hey, no, our jurisdiction's only on reserve. Off reserve, you really should go talk to the province. And there are some exceptions, you know, now, for example, health is a bit of an overlap. Okay, then we've got industry. Now, industry is just the entire sort of commercial private sector that First Nations have to actually deal with, arguably more than at the government level now. So you'll get a lot, First Nations will deal with a lot of what are called referrals. That's where a private party wants to do something in a traditional territory. It goes through a provincial system. The province refers that to the First Nation. The First Nation has to then decide how to respond. And so the challenge here is that it can be very overwhelming. The opportunity here is sometimes with industry deals, First Nations can basically get better deals done quicker with certain industry partners. It's also very complicated because there's a whole ton of private parties out there wanting to do business, and so it's a bit of a complicated field. When I was working for a larger company in the city, the provincial negotiations would sometimes become easy once you got to know all the key people in the province. When you're doing industry deals, there's so many different companies. Just because you have a great relationship with one mining company doesn't mean you've got a great relationship with another one, right? So the next slide here, I'm going to talk about the types of deals. I call them package deals versus layered deals. Now, we're starting to see the package deal, which is, for example, a treaty or self-government agreement. The idea is that you try and negotiate everything all at once into a package deal. I've worked for various treaty groups in the past, and I've seen some industry province overlap agreements, like pipelines, for example, try and take this package approach. The idea is you try and deal with every single jurisdiction and issue now, and then sign it, and it's done. So Nisga'a Treaty is definitely a package deal. The problem with package deals, well, there's a whole bunch of problems, but one of the big ones that governments and industry run into is that they take too long, 20, 25, 30 years to do a deal like this, and they're trying to deal with, short election cycles and so-called mandates to push through a pipeline, for example. So this often doesn't work for them. So then you end up in what's called the layered deal. So this started a few years ago, well, more than a few now, but where I first started to see it with the province, where they would go, okay, we're taking too long to try and resolve this treaty, so let's just try and do forestry. Let's try and do a forestry agreement. And then they'd say, oh my goodness, this is going to take maybe 10 years to do a forestry agreement, so let's just do a short-term forestry agreement. Can we just agree on these plots here for the next 4 or 5 years? And that would become a short-term forestry agreement. What we see, and I'm going to pick on pipelines here, is that the deal making that the province and federal governments have done and engaged around pipelines like Kinder Morgan and like the gas pipelines have taken the layered approach. And so what we see is that we have what's called a PBA, which was sort of the first agreement that was pushed very, very hard by the province, and that was a pipeline benefit agreement. And then they say, okay, they would essentially try and pave the way through the PBA, get an agreement from the First Nation to accept pipelines in their territory, and then encourage them to go and do an IBA, which is the impact benefit agreement with industry. And then once that deal is in place, go and do joint venture agreements with industry partners that might be doing pipeline construction, for example. And then lastly, you might end up in a true partnership situation. So where First Nations then are taking some of the money here and going and investing and buying actual assets, whether it be private land or large companies. Okay. Now I'm almost out of time, so I'm good. I'm on my last slide. Good deal. Now this is one I just wanted to mention because it comes up and I see it a lot. And it was sort of a question I anticipated. What makes a good deal? Now, one of the reasons I almost kind of gave up on community engagement, it was for a whole bunch of reasons. Actually, could be a whole other seminar or something. A lot of good content to be said about FPIC and community engagement. But what makes a good deal? 3 things, very high level. 1, good governance. So that means unity. Issues resolved, like who represents what for the First Nation. Free, prior, informed consent, really, really important. That requires a good governance structure on the First Nation side. Number 2 is leverage. So it's very hard to get a good deal if you're First Nation if you don't have any leverage. And then the 3rd one is allies. Now they're in an order because to kind of have number 2 and 3, we really need the governance thing solid up here. And it actually got to the point where I started lobbying when I was down in the city. I started lobbying the province, especially to sort of recognize that the federal and provincial governments have a hand in the destruction of First Nations culture and governments to the point where some of them are not functioning very well, and now they're trying to engage them and do meaningful agreements, but they need to first participate in working with the First Nation to rebuild robust governance. And believe it or not, we had some success. Like once the logic was understood, which is basically you're not going to get that certainty and that solid agreement you're looking for because this First Nation is not functioning on a governance level. That's not their fault. If you can come to the table with some capacity money to give to the First Nation to help them rebuild their government and sometimes participate in some pretty deep healing work, then there'll be a process and some important decisions, like how does that First Nation want to make a decision? How does that First Nation want to ratify a decision so that it will stand the test of time? Everybody sort of benefits once First Nations have a stronger governing system and things become much clearer. So that's it for me for now, and look forward to hearing from everyone else.
Great, thank you so much, Jacob. That was really helpful to provide that background and overview. We're now gonna hear from Ginger Gibson, Dr. Ginger Gibson, who's a director of the Firelight Group. She has also co-authored the Community Toolkit for Negotiation of Impact and Benefit Agreements that was included in the promotional stuff for this webinar. So I encourage you to check that out. So we'll pass it over to Ginger.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I just want to let you know I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground for many different nations, the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. And I just want to acknowledge the land of the people around me. As Nikki said, I'm with the Firelight Group, which is an Indigenous-owned research group. We work across the country and in the United States, and we work for Indigenous communities only. We work on large-scale energy projects. So if you've heard of Coastal GasLink, or if you've heard of Trans Mountain, or if you've heard of many different types of projects, we've focused on those and we've supported communities, Indigenous communities, with their research needs to leverage their positions and make differences and changes that are important to them through strong research. And today I was asked by Nikki to speak with you a little bit about my practice in negotiation of impact and benefit agreements. I'm non-Indigenous. My research firm is Indigenous owned, but I am a Scottish background, and I've worked for the last 20 or more years now on negotiation of impact and benefit agreements. And as Nikki said, there's a free resource that the Gordon Foundation makes available. It's on the web, but it's also something that can be mailed to every household. And that's a toolkit for communities in the negotiation of agreements. So I was going to reflect. I have about 7 or 8 points to make today about what is good practice for negotiation of IBAs. So I first wanted to start by saying these negotiated agreements, they in the end, they are a piece of paper. There's a piece of paper that gets negotiated between people. It's a contractual relationship, but the real important term is relationship. So good practice is a strong relationship that emerges between parties over time. I'll give you an example right now. I'm in charge of, along with my colleagues in the Clecho government in the Northwest Territories, there's agreements there that have been in place for 20 years. And strong relationships are relationships where in times of crisis, like right now, the agreement holds to the test of time. It holds up in a time of crisis, and it depends on those relationships. So it requires really well-funded positions within the Aboriginal government, strong ability to implement your own responsibilities in your own Indigenous government. It's much more than a piece of paper. So the relationship has to be defined at the beginning of a project and last all the way through, because there's real people who are hired and in the communities that are focused on implementing that agreement across the table. So during this crisis time, the Clecho government is having daily calls on what's going on at the work camps and managing everything from employment, emergency access to benefits through to how to keep staff safe as they come and go from the communities. So it really is all about building a relationship. My second point is that A strong practice, good practice is agreements that make sure that there's real results in communities over time. So not all agreements are just about oil and gas and forestry. There's lots of different types of agreements. We see currently that there's a lot of agreements in the north, especially through Nunavut, that there's lots of agreements that are related to conservation. So those are mandated by land claims and are required to required component when there's a conservation agreement. So it's not always about managing and controlling oil and gas and mining. But my point was that a good agreement means that there's real results in communities over time. A bad agreement means that there's a few benefits that occur early on and then don't get seen again. But a good agreement means that there's long-term community-defined benefits that are in place. A good example would be one community where there's a number of jobs for water quality monitoring in the community. They're setting their own baseline and ensuring that they're able to watch themselves. They're just a little bit away from the mine, but they're able to watch themselves for water quality changes and therefore go back into the community and provide people a sense of confidence that they're able to maintain their water quality. Another, even really small things matter. So for example, in one agreement, people made sure that during the mining that artists were able to access and procure soapstone for free for art. So there's lots of little things to look for, but good agreements are agreements that end up with real results in the community over time. Thirdly, I'd say that it's really important to have a variety of types of benefit that arise for lots of different sorts of people, so different populations in the community. I'll give you a couple of different examples. This relates to the last point, but it's more about making sure that people who are not going to, if it is a mining agreement, not everybody wants to be involved in mining or oil or gas. And when impacts are being experienced in people's country and there's benefits being secured, those benefits need to be seen to be broadly distributed amongst the population, particularly those folks who are never going to work at the mining project and who are not necessarily going to experience the direct benefits of business or employment. So by way of example, the Clecho government takes their funding from their negotiated agreements and allocates them to education scholarships. So every single Clecho student is able to, if they're going away for any type of university or college, they're able to access what's called one student programming, and $800,000 is set aside annually for education purposes. Another example, again by the Clecho, is that there's a summer student program set up. So for 8 weeks every summer, anyone who is between the ages of 18 and 35 is able to learn from their elders in the community as a full-time job. The first week is in language immersion. The second week is in, there's different skills that they're learning from their elders over time. So both elders and young people are learning the language and learning the culture and way of life as a result of that funding that's coming in from non-renewable resources. Another example from a different agreement in BC is where women wanted to set a cooperative, a washing cooperative and a sewing cooperative as a result of not wanting to be at the project itself. But that's an example of looking for the kinds of benefits that might be played out for women. There's lots of agreements where elder funds are set aside. And there's plenty of agreements now where environmental monitoring in or around the region is set aside. So in the De Beers Gacho Quay mine, there's an environmental monitoring agreement that allows for a cabin to be built just outside of the project site and traditional environmental monitoring to occur. When that traditional environmental monitoring occurs throughout the seasons, family can also travel in. So I think it's 4 families each summer are able to travel in to near the project site. And as a result of that, they're able to be out on the land annually. My fourth point is that the kinds of good practice is IBAs that change the project. So it's not just accepting IBAs and the negotiation of them doesn't mean you have to accept what is brought to you by industry or government. It means you can actively be involved in forming it. I'll give a couple of examples. The Boise Bay Mine, which has been in operation for many years now, one of the key points for the negotiators there was that they wanted the mine to have, the company was going for high tonnage and a shorter mine life. The nations, the Nunatsiavut and the Inuit there focused on instead having a 40-year mine life at a much lower tonnage. So that's a good example of people knowing what their priorities are and then negotiating for what their priorities are. Another example is protecting an area that's really important to you. So if it's the case for example, with the Squamish, there was an area that was vital for practice of culture and way of life. They ensured that that was protected and accessible. So the project footprint itself was changed as a result of the negotiation. Another example in the Northwest Territories where a nation was very concerned to monitor an area, and their negotiated agreement includes a clause where the company pays for a monitoring camp through the life of the project and is required to look at the results of monitoring and engage with the community. So another example of what is good practice is that people think carefully about what consent is. I'll just ask Kayleen to put up a slide. I didn't use paper like Jacob. I loved Jacob's paper presentation though. And I would just say that that these agreements, they do relate to consent. And I would just note that consent, the type of consent that is given through negotiated agreements, it really varies. So it's super important to think very clearly and carefully about what type of consent is given. And why I put this slide up is to show you, I just want to acknowledge my co-author to the IBA toolkit, Kieran O'Farkley, whose work this is based on. But the idea that there's different types of consent that are given and to different components of the project. So there are many agreements agreements IBA started to get negotiated in the late 80s. They continue to be negotiated now, but many of the agreements, even now, are agreements that try to limit the rights of Indigenous parties severely, constrain their rights by, for example, asking people to, the council to be involved in restraining members' rights, or in, I had an example just this week where we were negotiating with a company and the company came in and asked for 4 times the area that the nation was willing to consider. So they were looking to consent for a huge area that was much bigger than the project. So it's very important to be mindful of what type of consent is being given and around what. You can just take that slide away, Kayleen. Thank you. The important, I think the operative point for good process is that it's really important to have good ability to check in over time. There's many agreements that don't have, any way to check in or change things over time. And so it's important to have in the agreement a way to evaluate things over time. I think I just showed you an example of how consent is variously given and operates in different ways. Legislation is going to change this art of the possible for impact and benefit agreements. I'll just note that in the Northwest Territories, I was part of the team that was revising the legislation there. So Bill C-34 requires impact and benefit agreements. So that's a good example of legislation changing the field. BC had legislation this past year, Bill C-69, which is a broader piece of enabling legislation. I think in this administration, we'll probably see federal private member bills brought forward again. I'll just conclude with 2 points, which is the one that I think legislation is something that's going to really shift the art of the possible and make it so that bad actors are required to negotiate agreements. It's often the case that it's quite hard to negotiate an agreement and you have to use every leverage point you can to get a proponent to the table. But I will note that I think that agreements are at times can be very useful and helpful to an Indigenous government. I do see them extending into other areas. So for example, I see the federal government and the provincial government starting to negotiate, provincial governments starting to negotiate these types of arrangements alongside IBAs. So you may have an IBA, but you also may negotiate an accommodation agreement with the federal government around major projects, and an accommodation with the provincial government. So we see that practice happening all the way across the country now. And secondly, we see agreements around, not only around exploration, we see them around operating projects, and we also see mines that have been in place since the 1960s and never had an agreement. We are now seeing many of those companies come in and say, I need to get with this and have a negotiated arrangement with the nations around me. So I think that's something that's bound to continue to happen. In addition, I think we'll continue to see the types of conservation agreements that are emerging across the north come to be something that's more valuable and more accessible in the south. And Firelight is going to be issuing a report on conservation agreements in the not too distant future. So I just want to thank everybody. I'm going to look forward to the questions and also to my the next presentation by Sherry.
Great. Thank you so much, Ginger. That was a great overview or background too. And I think your point there, your slide on consent, I think will play in a little bit to what Sherry will be talking about. So there you are. So our next presenter is an assistant professor in criminology at Ryerson University in Toronto, and she is also a research director for the Yellowhead Institute. So without further ado, Sherry.
Good morning, or I should say good afternoon from where I am. Good morning to those of you further west. I want to thank Nikki and Kirby for inviting me to participate, and it's really, I've already learned so much from Jacob and Ginger on this call, and I'm looking forward to contributing some thoughts. My reflections come from a different place. I don't have experience negotiating IBAs. I'm primarily a researcher and an analyst, and I work with communities on the ground. And some of what I'm going to talk about today draws on that research, and then also my access to two IBAs that I've read. One is a De Beers IBA with Attawapiskat that I saw a few years ago, and the other that I'm really going to focus on is an IBA between Coastal GasLink and Wet'suwet'en First Nation that was sent to me in confidence, and I won't be disclosing the name of the band, but I think there are some really important things that we can learn from that agreement. It was negotiated in 2016. It's unsigned, so it's not certain that it's a final agreement, so we don't know if it's actually the one in operation, which was signed in 2018. But it does give us some indications, I think, of what companies want to secure in IBAs. And it also, I think, gives us an opportunity to think more about what role IBAs play within the larger political landscape of Indigenous rights and title that are playing out across the country and raise some important questions. So as I go, I want to highlight some of the things, the actual text in this agreement, and to raise questions about what are the implications for Aboriginal rights and title and for Indigenous law in the negotiation of these agreements over lands, territories, and resources. So as most people will know who have tuned in, Coastal GasLink is a subsidiary company of TC Energy, and they sought the consent or the license from First Nations along the pipeline route of a natural gas pipeline in order to proceed with construction. And while 20 First Nations signed these agreements, there were a lot of people led by the hereditary leadership of the Wet'suwet'en Nation who opposed the agreement. And so what we witnessed for a couple of years was a very public and somewhat spectacular and obviously violence in terms of the final military incursions onto Wet'suwet'en territory, but a very, very extreme unfolding of what can happen in the context of IBAs. And as Ginger and Jacob pointed out, really what it says about the nature of IBA consent and questions about collective title and the authority of IBAs to authorize consent for companies on Indigenous lands. So, first of all, the primary, I guess not primary concern, but one of the first concerns that we can see in the 2016 document is that Coastal GasLink aims to secure what they call the irrevocable consent of the First Nation with whom they're negotiating. And experts on IBAs have really been warning for years that serious issues can arise when commercial law or private law is used to interpret Aboriginal constitutional rights. And this is one of the problems that I think that raises. Here we can see why. So the draft agreement states, quote, "This is the full and final satisfaction of any present or future claim by the First Nation against Coastal GasLink pipeline for any infringement by the project of the First Nations Section 35 rights." And so there's a separate provision that affirms that the band can still take legal action against BC, but there's a kind of limitation or a restriction on any further interpretation of the band's Section 35 rights outside of this particular agreement. So I guess I have a few questions that we could raise here. One is, what is the meaning of irrevocable consent in the context of, for example, FPIC as protected in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Free, prior, and informed consent seems somewhat diametrically opposed to irrevocable consent, given that informed consent can mean, or is interpreted to mean, an ongoing and fully informed consent that can change as different situations arise, whereas this locks communities into the precise terms of the agreement. And further to that point, there's more language in the agreement that restricts any assertions of Aboriginal rights outside of how they're defined in the agreement. The agreement states, if the First Nation obtains any interest in land, including Aboriginal title or ownership or jurisdiction over lands used by the project, the First Nation affirms the authorizations will continue and that these changes will not affect the agreement. So therefore, the unsigned agreement restricts the band from challenging any of the company's legal rights of development, even in the case of changes to First Nations legal rights as recognized by courts and governments. So I'll raise the question that I raised in an article that I wrote for the Yellowhead Institute a couple of months ago, which is, why is a private energy company determining the final limit of a community's constitutional rights and the exercise of those rights and any future rights that the band might gain? And one answer that we can provide here briefly is that Coastal GasLink is defining these rights because governments have somewhat downloaded their own fiduciary obligations onto companies. So the duty to consult, which is a constitutional right it's an Aboriginal right that's protected by the Constitution, Section 35, and is a principle that was determined in the Haida and Taku River Tlingit First Nation Supreme Court of Canada decisions in 2004, established that the federal and provincial governments have a duty to engage with First Nations when their rights are in danger of infringement to protect them from being run roughshod. So these rights that governments are meant to protect are being negotiated through private commercial law, which raises questions about whether or not the provincial and federal governments are in some ways downloading these obligations. And perhaps we can discuss this in the context of Ginger's comments about how now there's legislation that's being introduced in order to better protect or to safeguard or to parse out the meaning of these rights. But to some extent, energy companies in defining Section 35 rights raise questions about whether this can and should be done through private law, or whether these are public law matters. Of course, there's the question of confidentiality clauses in agreements that raise questions about consent. Some of the communities that I've worked with have expressed deep concerns that they're not allowed to discuss the terms of agreements outside of their own band council even. So these agreements are confidential to the extent that they can't be shared outside of the community, but sometimes even within the chief and council. So that raises questions about the nature of consent as negotiated even internally, which leads me to the next point that I want to read from the IBA, which is a question about, I believe Jacob mentioned this, clauses or inclusions of restrictions on community members being able to publicly dissent or debate or contest the terms of the agreements, which sets up a kind of informer status for the band council themselves. So the language in the Coastal GasLink agreement reads, the First Nation will not take and will take all reasonable actions to persuade First Nation members to not take any action, legal or otherwise, including any media or social media campaign that may impede, hinder, frustrate, delay, stop, or interfere with the project's contractors, any authorizations or any approval processes. So the document, you can read this as positioning the band to act as paid informants to quell internal dissent within the First Nation against the project, because as the agreement states, it's at the cost of financial considerations or payouts that are on the line if the band council is not honoring this requirement. Dana Nadine Scott, who's a law professor at York University and has done a lot of research on IBAs, she recently completed a research project that interviewed dozens of lawyers who draft IBAs, says that this language is highly problematic and is often referred to as the gag order, preventing communities from raising concerns when new issues come to light. And it also speaks in support. It also, I think, quite frankly, causes and seems like it would cause incredible internal turmoil within communities, not being able to speak out and support family members or friends or people who are, for example, being criminalized for being contempt of injunctions obtained by companies because of these IBAs. Another issue that I want to raise here about the Coastal GasLink IBA in particular are some of the financial considerations that are involved. And this is not in any way a critique of First Nations for signing agreements that promise resource revenue sharing, which is obviously, critical source of income for communities, as well as possibility of a critical source of employment. But I want to turn the lens towards provincial governments around the need for communities to sign agreements in order to access financial benefits, and look at it in terms of how much the provincial and federal government, for example, were backstopping and subsidizing LNG Canada for the commodity and the infrastructure to transport that commodity versus what they actually offered to the First Nations themselves. So the agreement that we obtained also included financial documents that are also public, but were included in this agreement as well, that showed that BC was putting up $1 million to the band in signing payments, $5 million in construction and in-service payments, and an estimated $40 million in total in annual operation payments over 40 years. And so this is just one agreement, there's around 20. So if you calculate or aggregate all those figures, it's about $1 billion in subsidies. But if you look at how much money LNG Canada is being subsidized by the province of BC, it's actually amounts to huge amounts of benefits to the companies themselves as much as it is to the First Nation, and raises questions about the viability of these industrial projects without massive provincial subsidies. So there's 3 types of subsidies that are really involved in LNG Canada. I think this is a material to IBAs again, because it raises questions about the province's claims that, you know, no one should dissent against these opportunity for communities to sign IBAs because it brings much needed resource revenues into communities. On the other hand, provinces are not adequately funding communities while at the same time offering massive amounts of subsidies to corporations, raising questions about the kind of choices that communities are making when they agree to sign pipelines. If the money was there and given by provinces, would the financial incentives be as strong to sign IBAs? So the 3 types of subsidies, public subsidies for the company, are the direct subsidies. So they're upwards of about $7 billion in subsidies provided to LNG Canada through different things. For example, the sales tax suspension, carbon tax suspension, federal government subsidies in for giving steel tariffs to China to bring in necessary equipment. Then there's the write-off that Coastal GasLink can make in paying money out to communities, to band councils, and which reduces their profits and the amount of taxes that they'll pay. And then the direct money that BC government is paying communities that provides a kind of discount to the companies themselves for providing that money directly. So I've just raised ethical questions about whether or not BC Premier John Horgan is in a conflict of interest in the sense of defending the pipeline while providing massive subsidies to ensure its viability. I think I have a few more minutes. In the agreement, there are also employment numbers that are guaranteed by the company, and I've seen this in another agreement as well. The employment numbers are actually quite low and are often listed as targets. So maybe this comes back to Jacob's point about, and Ginger's point really about, there are good agreements and there are bad agreements. And so the language around targets, maybe we could have a conversation about how substantive that is and whether there's room for negotiation. In this particular agreement, there's only a guarantee of approximately 150 direct and indirect jobs, and that's only during operations of the construction of the pipeline. There are a few commitments to job training and driver's license training and so on, but nothing really substantive beyond that. In the agreement, there's also language around the conversion of the natural gas pipeline to crude oil in the future, and a requirement that the company go back to the community for consent if such a transition is to occur. I think that's something that I want to raise here, perhaps again as a question and not a statement. It seems that that there's a possibility for the conversion of the pipeline to crude oil at some point. That's in the agreement, that was never publicly discussed, but perhaps this is just a sign of a good agreement in the sense that the community managed to get language in that enforce the need to go back and get community consent in order to proceed with that kind of transition of the pipeline. That's a question that I have that I'm interested to hear other people's thoughts on. I think we've covered the question of Aboriginal title and the collective title holders and the problem with IBAs being negotiated on a band-to-band basis when the Supreme Court decisions, at least in Delgamuukw and Silhotin and others, affirm that the proper title holders are at the level of the nation. And so the disaggregation of the nation into bands that sign individual agreements for massive infrastructure projects like pipelines, I think raises really important questions about whether these IBAs are in compliance with the Aboriginal title jurisprudence and, you know, the precedents set on the holders of who the Aboriginal rights and titles holders are, which have been a huge issue of contention, not just with Coastal GasLink, but with the Trans Mountain Pipeline as well, where those who are opposing or holding out from signing IBAs are saying that other bands don't have the authority to negotiate on behalf of the Secwepemc Nation, for example, or other nations. I guess the last point is around fair sharing in terms of resource revenue. Sharing, and maybe again, I'll just leave this here as a question so we can move on to other participants' questions and comments. But certainly in different industries, there's a lot of ways that companies can hide their assets. I'm not an expert on this, but there's an excellent book that's particular to the mining industry by Joan Kuyak called Unearthing Justice, where she talks in great detail about the ways that companies can hide their actual profits, leaving very little in the end for resource revenue sharing in the IBAs. And that can look like very, very small percentages ultimately of financial redistribution. And I think that's something that could be discussed as well. I guess the only thing I'll say maybe to leave off is that these agreements can only recognize Aboriginal rights and title. They do not create or define them. Those come from Indigenous law. And so I'm interested also to hear more and to think more about the intersections between Indigenous law and IBAs as well. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Shiri. Wow, lots to take in. If everybody else wants to also, you know, come on video, we'll start with some question and answers. A little bit of a discussion. Ginger, I don't know if you can join us. There's been some great questions that have come in. I think just not so much on the fair share, but just building on the piece, Shiri, that you just said about you know, whether IBAs are in compliance with collective rights. I wonder too, Jacob, you had mentioned that this is also recognized in some legal cases. I think both that there's collective rights, but also I think intergenerational rights. At least I think that was in Silkatine. And I'm curious how these are addressed or not in IBAs, which I think you've sort of touched on there, but also is the onus on Indigenous governance or on the government and companies to address these? Jacob or Shiri or Ginger?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. Yeah, so the collectiveness of the rights, it's a really fluid thing right now. What I mean by that is my experience is government or industry will make an effort to not try and deal with collective rights because to them it seems kind of complicated or difficult, or it's not very well understood. And they'll tend to try and find the path of least resistance. What I mean by that is if you can just get a signature on a piece of paper in the minds of a government or industry negotiator, that's all you need, and that's a done deal. However, if that agreement then gets challenged, and I'm not a lawyer, I'll be really clear on that. I've worked a lot with lawyers as part of ratifying agreements, but I'm not one. But just going back to kind of common sense, like if that agreement then gets challenged and thrown out, it's not a very strong, it's not a very solid agreement. And one of the sort of ways we've seen this happen is when the person or party signing that piece of paper didn't have a mandate from the collective title holders. Okay, and we've also seen that happen not just in the world of agreements, but in the world of sort of permitting, where the province or federal government has gone forward and sort of given permission to a company to go do something without getting the consent from the collective nation. And we saw that with Enbridge, you know, where Kikatla, where I'm actually from, spent a huge amount of money. Interestingly enough, they got money from a short-term agreement, kind of part of the layered deal thing. And then they made a collective decision together with the hereditary chiefs and the elected leadership to sort of invest that money in fighting Enbridge through their permits, that they hadn't been adequately consulted, and that collective decision or standard hadn't been met. The federal court agreed, and that's essentially what stopped the Enbridge project, was a legal challenge that threw out all the permits, right? So I don't know if that's a very good answer. I find that a lot of times these agreements tend to be on very shaky ground because they're just hoping that they won't get challenged, that they'll get signed, that they won't get challenged. I know Ginger talked about like, you know, these good agreements and standing the test of time. Honestly, a lot of agreements I see just haven't done that. You know, they haven't gone through that proper process of getting consent or consensus from the collective rights holders, and that's very, very shaky ground to build something on.
Let me just follow on Jacob to say that whenever it's built on shaky ground, it tends to become an agreement that causes more conflict than it does good. And in those contexts, I generally would recommend to my client, where there isn't a strong mandate, that no agreement is better than a bad agreement. And we haven't really raised that point. But let me first respond to the question you issued to us, Nikki, which is I think that all parties have a space to fill in this regard with respect to consent and FPIC, free prior informed consent. We do need to see legislation in order to deal with and curb bad actors. There's lots of bad actors out there that don't want to negotiate agreements, and where a nation wants agreement there's lots of nations I work for that they're implementing 10 to 15 agreements, and they want agreements with everyone in the area, and they're very well versed in negotiating them, and they're very well they have strong capacity and strong governance to do so, but the company won't come to the table. So we do have space there for federal legislation, and it is, I think, the duty of the federal government to come into this space, and it should be space that's charged and owned by Indigenous governments to say what it looks like. What does the implementation of free prior informed consent look like in Canadian legislation? How does it play out in the mining, mineral and exploration industry in particular, which is the industry that tends to alienate rights the most? And so the territorial government, NWT, has tried, we did try very hard for the last 2 years. We've been at the table trying to implement that concept through the Mineral Resource Act, and we do have a new Mineral Resource Act. It's not perfect. There's lots of things that I would still like to have another go at, but it moved the bar forward. One of your people that was asking questions, I think I'm not sure who, I can't remember who issued it, but asked what is it that gets companies to the table? What is leverage? So I drew a picture, Jacob.
Nice.
Jacob, I drew a picture because I love Jacob's picture so much. And it has a smiley face on it. It was mostly, I started there. But what is it that brings companies to the table? I would just say somebody issued that question, and what is leverage? And I'd say leverage, at times we can't get companies to the table, and so you have to employ every tactic. So hopefully you have legislation. Often you don't. Then you appeal to the United Nations Declaration, which requires that companies negotiate, but often companies don't care. And then you have a couple of other tools. So the other tools I had in here: legislation, the United Nations Declaration, and then I think you have to appeal to a couple of other areas. Sometimes you have to appeal to the media to embarrass the company. Sometimes that's what they care about. Sometimes you have to appeal to their shareholders or to their board. So sometimes you have to think about what provides you leverage, and sometimes the company only cares about money. So in those cases, you have to look at who you need to know who the company is. You need to know who's on their board, and what will change their minds in order to bring them to the table.
Great, thanks. Kirby, you want to ask questions?
Yeah, can you hear me? Ginger mentioned the conservation agreements, especially in the north. I'm interested, this comes from the question, I'm interested in the idea that IBAs are used to address direct and indirect costs of production as part of conservation. How are the benefits and impacts considered in these instances? I wonder about these processes in light of reconciliation and the federal interests in Indigenous protection and conservation, conserved areas, and how this may look different in similar in the South. Does that
Thanks.
make sense?
Yeah, sure. I'll just comment briefly on this, Kirby, and thank you. I just want to mention Firelight was funded by Tides Canada to issue a report, which will be coming out shortly within the next month on conservation agreements. We brought together Inuit negotiators across the North to look at the art of the and the practice of agreements, of conservation agreements. Those are agreements where people set aside large areas. Sometimes there's, just like with mineral and forestry agreements, oftentimes it's the case that those agreements don't tend to get implemented very well. And so there's agreements that are older that are beginning to look very unfair, but they do set aside large areas of land. Sometimes that can alienate title. So there's lots of issues to unpack with this, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but the kinds of benefits that are in play are that people have another area of contiguous land. Sometimes that's another area for a land claim, similar to a land claim that wasn't gained through a land claim. There's lots of funding that can be set aside for cultural practices, language, culture, and way of life. There's lots of jobs, conservation-like jobs, which people often really want those types of positions. There's a whole range of benefits, but also impacts. And again, areas of land being withdrawn, it's absolutely vital that people consider the question of what rights, harvesting rights are in play around conservation agreements. Some of the older agreements actually restricted rights. And so that's an issue that clearly is of concern.
Great, thanks for that. I just have a follow-up question on leverage. Is there, for anyone who might be able to answer this, just like, are there, I mean, that was great. Thank you for doing that diagram. Is there also, I know that I heard one case where a nation was trying to deal with impacts from a mine, and they didn't have any leverage, and they weren't able to get changes to it, and then they used the leverage with the provincial government who wanted the gas pipeline through to actually get that change happening. And or do some nations like the Haida have additional leverage because of some title or rights that have already been proven in other cases, or that sort of thing? I wonder if you can speak to that, and also whether leverage is sometimes used for, and I think you alluded to this in your presentation, but somebody had sent the question if they're able to change the project design and implement something more in line with their values.
Do you mind if I take a quick stab at this?
Go for it.
It's something I've seen a lot. I mean, so I grew up in Gitxsan territory, through the 80s and till the very early 90s, and I saw the Gitxsan exerting a huge amount of leverage through direct action during the Algamut court case, in the case of rail blockades, road blockades, shutting down sawmills, to big effect. So, I mean, that is one form of leverage, is direct action that is not always the most tasteful to people, but you know what, it's really effective if it's feasible. So a project I worked on was up here in the north on a mine, and some of the community actually blockaded the mine construction. And it wasn't actually it was more of a spontaneous blockade, but they went and worked together as a nation, and they actually ended up using the blockade as a really big leverage point to get from just sort of IBA mode to actually co-management and actually controlling the mine. So controlling the human resources, controlling the environmental monitoring. Some of that, well, actually a lot of that was actually leverage through the blockading. And I know the Haidas did the same thing. I mean, the Haidas, their sort of court wins came after blockading back in the 90s, forestry blockades in the 80s that ensured protection of some of their most sacred sites in forestry. So that's one form of leverage, is direct action, and there's a lot of them, and I think Sherry and Ginger can speak to them. Another one I'll just really quickly mention that just supports what you said, that example of using a pipeline, the province coming to you and wanting something like an agreement for a pipeline, can then be used as leverage to get a better deal on a mine somewhere where you feel like you don't have as much leverage. An example, I'll give you a very specific one. So there was a hydro project, a large hydro project. Part of that deal just around that project between the province and the First Nation is that the First Nation had control over hydro permitting for a certain number of years, as one of the benefits of saying yes, because they had a lot of concern, like they wanted to have control where the towers went, environmental impact. So they took over control of the permitting from the province for power transmission in their territory. And then a mining company came along a couple of years later, and we're being belligerent. We're being really difficult. And so what they said is, they said, hey, we're going to withhold your power. We're not going to allow any permits to your mine. And that worked. It worked really well. They came to the table because those projects, once they've gone ahead and started pre-construction, once they get to a certain stage, it costs them so much money to be delayed. So those are just a couple examples, and I'll stop there, and I know there's lots.
Great, thanks. Anyone else want to take a stab, or Kirby, you want to go with the next question?
Okay. This is around, should it not be considered best practice for IBAs to be fully public? It seems problematic that in Canada, we are shy about pushing for such transparency when we're simultaneously pushing for transparency in extractive industry, revenue payments to governments, transparency in public procurement, etc.
I think, and just to add on to the transparency piece, I think also sometimes a lack of that being able to share between communities to finding out if you're even getting a good deal or what, you know, to help leverage your negotiations or whatever. So yeah, there's a couple questions there on transparency.
Or even within your own community, I think a lot of these IBAs are negotiated and signed, and the community themselves don't know what's involved.
Can I say something quickly about that? I feel like transparency is often an issue that's raised about IBAs, and I have two sort of opposing thoughts about it. One is that I think First Nations should have a right to have confidential agreements if that's what they want, but that choice is not on the table. And so, as Nikki points out, there's a huge inequality at the negotiating table when you have lawyers and mineral economists and negotiators who have seen sometimes hundreds of agreements, not even just in Canada, but they may be negotiating these agreements internationally and have the benefit of understanding what the actual bar is for negotiation and what the averages are, whereas communities don't have that information because, as you point out, communities can't share that information between themselves, and that gives them a real disadvantage at the negotiating table. But it also raises the question about whether the bars should be set for IBAs at negotiating tables, and whether or not there should be some legislation or some actual regulation around what companies can do. Because why should a community that doesn't have the leverage of other communities, that may not have critical infrastructure running through or near their territories that they can blockade, why should they be at a disadvantage, and why should they be potentially ripped off what other communities are getting because they don't have the same access to either negotiators or capacity to engage in direct action, and so on. So I do really think this is a huge issue. And as Kirby said, and that I've heard from communities before, as I mentioned, sometimes in the IBAs, there's stipulations that the band council themselves can't even tell the community beyond them. And that raises very, very serious critical questions about accountability and governance embedded in the negotiation process itself.
Thanks. I'll just comment that the confidentiality issue is always a big one. It's never going to go away, and I really appreciate what was just said by Sherry, which is that if nations want that confidentiality, they should be able to go after it. And sometimes they do, right? So the reasons that people want confidentiality is sometimes to protect sensitive commercial information, sometimes for their own JVs that they're structuring. Sometimes they are protecting the financial information because they don't want the federal government to claw back funds. So there's a whole range of reasons why a nation would require confidentiality. And certainly all of the pitfalls that Shiri named are certainly in play, right? And there's lots of strategic ways around them that we've discovered over the years. They're documented in the IBA Community IBA Toolkit. There's lots of ways around it, right? You can go to the other nation using and ask to share information. There's plenty of tools now in play, and nations that are negotiating across the table from seniors. I always use 3 strategies. If I can't get an agreement they already have, if they haven't negotiated any agreements, I usually go to the other nations and that they've negotiated agreements with and ask for them. And good practice generally is between nations that will share with each other. But if I can't, then I go in the commodity. So if it's gold, I'll look for what the standard is in the commodity. Legislation has provided us some good tools on financials. So the Extractive Sector Transparencies Measures Act has required that companies that make payments over $100,000 to communities, to Indigenous governments, report. And they've been doing that since 2018, but it's pretty shaky data. And so it's not terribly useful to date. But I would just comment that another comment that's come up by Christine Martin is about the division that the gag orders and confidentiality tend to engender. And I think Shiri really did, she signaled what is worst practice in some of the kinds of consent requirements. And it's why it's so important. There's not a nation in this country that should be signing an agreement that doesn't allow them to talk about the agreement to their members. So I've never negotiated an agreement like that, and I never will, because nations have the right to, as Jacob spoke to, their collective rights. They have the right to be informed and see the full agreement. And if they can't, then it's a bad agreement. But to address Christine's point, I really think that it's the case that if an agreement is lousy, and is causing further social conflict, there's corrective mechanisms you can put in place that are not just about the agreement, but policies. So nations can issue their own expectations with respect to consultation and engagement in their country that look different, right? That look different than the agreement themselves, or look different than provincial or federal legislation or guidance on these points. So I think there's different ways to control it, even in the context where you have an agreement that has caused conflict.
I'm just going to add something really quickly here from the community engagement side. So I'm just going to jump right into advising mode. Like, I'll pretend I'm your advisor. I would say that if you want the agreement to have certainty, you have to be able to share it with your members. And there are a lot of great ways to do that. If you're going to be sharing it with all your members, it's going to get leaked. It will. I've worked on so many, and it does every single time. So prepare for it to get leaked. What is your plan? If you're industry, if you're government, what's your plan on how you're going to handle that potentially hitting the news and the headlines being like millions of dollars, taxpayer dollars going to, you know, Indians who are getting more taxpayer money and blah, blah, blah. And it's going to be nasty. And how are you going to deal with that? And if you're First Nation, how are you going to deal with it hitting Facebook? Somebody's going to take a picture on their phone and post it, and it's going to hit Facebook. So what's your plan? So that's my advice, is if you want it to be certain, you want it to not get overturned in court potentially, you have to inform your people. They have to be informed to achieve any kind of close to FPIC standard. And if that happens, it's going to be leaked. What's your plan? Make sure you have a plan to handle it.
Awesome. Kirby, do you want to ask the next question? And just before you do, somebody did point out that with the new DRIPA legislation, it looks like some agreements might eventually need to be posted publicly. But
just one more thing, Nikki, really quick. I'll be fast.
Yeah.
Going back to the previous thing about leverage, and just adding to what Shiri said, there is on my list, the third one was allies. And I just want to just speak to that, because this is where, if you're a First Nation that does not have leverage, like Shiri said, you don't have a major thing going through your territory or something to leverage. This is where allies is so important. And I want to say, I've seen cases like this where a nation has had nothing. And in one big project I worked on, it was just so heartwarming and cool, because there were multiple bands, First Nations, that had no leverage. And the nations to the north of them that were being heavily impacted by projects said, we're not going to give you anything until you take care of our essentially allies to the south that you made promises to in the past that you broke. And they stuck to that for over 20 years. And right up to, apparently right up to a few days before signing, they were saying, no, you need to put this in. The government was saying, no, we can't correct that stuff. It's going to be too expensive. And they said, well, you're not getting anything from us. Right up to 3 days before signing. And finally they reneged and added an extra few $100 million in to compensate these Southern First Nations because they were historical allies. And that's a critically important point that I think we need to keep in mind, that as First Nations, it's so important to have allies. We saw that with the Wet'suwet'en just this year, where the action of allies really ramped up the pressure on government and industry, and you saw their tone changing in the media as the pressures wore on.
Great, thank you.
Okay, this one's for Shiri. Can you speak to parallel examples of IBAs with hereditary governments as opposed to band council governments?
I don't know of them. I just learned from Jacob that that with Northern Enbridge, the case was an alliance between the hereditary and the band council chiefs, which I knew about, but obviously he can speak to with much more authority. The community that I work most closely with is the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, and rather than negotiate an IBA to deal with resource revenue sharing, they had what Jacob called, I think, a total package agreement, where they tried to get resource management over their entire territory that would deal with every industry. So maybe I'll pass it to Jacob. Maybe he can answer that question.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this goes back, Kirby, to the governance, that number one thing I was talking about, where if a First Nation has their internal governance sorted out. So I mean, we don't have enough time to go into this broad Canadian sort of history lesson for our viewers, but you know, through the severe impacts of colonization and genocide, both cultural and regular genocide, the impacts of First Nations, you see some First Nations that were greatly reduced to the point where their hereditary or pre-colonial governance systems didn't survive in enough of a form to sort of continue on, and basically got absorbed by the Indian Act system, which is band council system. And you see that, I'd say, the majority of the country, that's been the case. And I've actually worked with band councils where this is still a fairly fresh thing, where they're still trying to figure out, like, is there enough of this hereditary system to sort of revive, or not revive, but strengthen, or do we just kind of keep it all rolled in? So in some First Nations, they're even talking about, do we go back and revive our hereditary system? How does that look? And now the interesting thing, so again, trying to put this into a nutshell, there are First Nations, mostly in my experience in British Columbia, who were impacted more recently, right, through colonization, where you have intact hereditary systems that are healthy and operational. The Wet'suwet'en are a perfect example of that. Like, every Wet'suwet'en person I've talked to knows which house and which clan they belong to, which is amazing. I did an engagement with another First Nation here in British Columbia, and less than 30% of the population, I mean, this was an authority, like, we got to every single member of the nation, a few thousand of them, less than 30% knew where they fit in terms of the hereditary system, right? So in that case, the hereditary collective rights were represented by the band, whereas with Wet'suwet'en, you've got both functioning elected systems, and then you've got a fully functional hereditary system. They used to be reconciled back in the past, and they're currently not. So it's a complicated answer. It's a complicated situation because our history is complicated, and there's a lot of loss, and it's not there's no prescriptive answer to that one.
Thanks. Kirby, is it you or me who asked the question now?
I asked that one, I think.
Okay.
Maybe could I just treat, there's a whole bunch of questions that have come up around what's in agreements. Do you mind if I just treat a bunch of questions at once?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
So there's been somebody who's asked about remediation. I would say that remediation is probably one of the weaker areas in agreements. I would say there's always environmental components in an agreement, always. And so whether it's watching what the company does, making sure you have strong and robust reporting requirements, and requiring that you're able to have a voice in the regulatory process, it's always the case that the company has to come and go. And what people's vision of that going looks like is fairly unclear, especially when it's just starting out. And so I'd say that this is an area that's ripe for us to do some really solid work on. Just yesterday, in getting the mandate on negotiation for a particular project, the director of the Indigenous government said that she really wants to see the vision of success for vegetation. She wants to see benchmarks for success to return to traditional use, and thresholds. So that's an example of something that you can see playing out for remediation. I would just say that I think there's lots of work to do here. One other point was about targets that Shiri raised earlier. I'll just say from an employment perspective, some of these projects are 40-year projects, some of them are 10-year projects, but employment and the opportunity to have employment if people choose that project in their territory is a vital benefit. And so I do see targets throughout agreements. Sometimes I see targets in one context I'm currently negotiating. There's targets that are set aside where the company doesn't meet them. They will put into a fund that is generating, that will be used towards training. So if they're not able to reach the established target, I see all sorts of targets out there, from targets that are established in the context of the agreement, and they're a set firm target. So you will employ 200 people. Or I see targets where we develop it in plans. So there's lots of different ways to develop targets. On the language question,
just on that, Ginger or Jacob, somebody also asked, how then are those enforced? Like, I know that, right, for instance, in a case with a mine in Northwest BC for their job targets anyway, that they have someone hired part-time who consistently from the nation is consistently trying to hold the mine, with their feet to the fire and make sure that they're following through. But what is it, arbitration, contract law, or if Canadian law is referenced, is there other legal action? Like, how are these sort of, as opposed to all that negotiation and then the company thinking like, phew, got it, now we can just.
Yeah, and I'll just comment on that, Jacob. You could probably follow up, but the reality is that on many of these things, it's the relationship that matters. So it's the tightness of that relationship that will cause it to be enforced. So, and I'm not talking about contractual law being enforced. I'm talking about people living up to their expectations. There's a number of things that need to be in place. You need to have really strong people. Let's just speak about HR for the moment. You need to have really strong people in the nation working on making sure that everybody's coming to them, that they're getting their driver's licenses, that they're getting all of the many small things that cause people not to be able to get employed. There needs to be people in the nation whose job it is to push people forward into the project. On the other side, in the company itself, there has to be somebody who cares about it. And when I say relationship, it means that the people in both parties need to actually care about each other and want to make it work. Where there's no one that cares about it in the company, it doesn't matter what you're going to have for employment targets. It's probably not going to be lived up to if there's not somebody who is on speed dial every day finding out why somebody is not showing up to work or how they can fill a seat. But when it comes to actually enforcing these things, it's pretty rare that we've gone after enforcement in, and so I know Jamie asked about this, but I would just say that the folks that have actually gone into a judicial review in the Kitikmeot Inuit have actually gone through the first judicial review of an IBA not being implemented, and they were successful. So there is cases now. Usually we have very robust dispute resolution processes in agreements. Oftentimes in bad agreements, they're not robust. But you should be able to go after some of these things, and in one case we've seen them be successful.
Yeah, I think Ginger answered it there. It's all in the language of the agreement in terms of setting up the process. If I was, again, going into advisor mode, I would say you need to have a really strong arbitration, dispute resolution type process in your agreements. Always go for negotiation or using leverage before you end up in court, because court's super expensive. However, I'll give you a quick example. So I saw two different agreements, one that was fairly lengthy and robust around a supply to a First Nation of a product and service, the same one to two different nations. One was really lengthy and had clear sort of breaches. So if they didn't do this or that, like say twice in a year, then the First Nation is going to get all these benefits or are going to be released of certain obligations. And then I saw the same type of agreement. It was like a page long, page and a half, nothing in there, no enforcement at all. And the company just was just not doing what they're supposed to do, right? Because there was no consequences, and the only real path for the First Nation would have been to go to court in that case, which sucks, or to negotiate prior. So it's all in making sure the agreements are well negotiated and have a proper process that hopefully avoids even negotiation. Where you're able to just say, hey, you're late on this, or you didn't meet this. That's your first breach out of two that you're allowed, and they'll just go, okay, all right, we're taking it seriously now.
Right.
So that's the ideal.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. Maybe to end with a big doozy, Kirby, I know that you had this question too. So that overarching question: are impact benefit agreements consent? And how is it that sometimes there's the clauses where nations are not allowed to speak about their IBAs, but industry is allowed to wave them around and say, see, we've got 20 agreements with all of these, band councils, let's say, and they're allowed to talk about the agreements, but, there's the clause order or whatever. And I think as someone mentioned, Shiri described irrevocable consent, and the Wet'suwet'en IBA is that nature of consent changing? And Jinder, you provided in that thing, what does a +2 consent model actually look like in an IBA? So big question to end on, but I think a lot of us, is an IBA consent? And I imagine the answer is not always, but it would be good to hear from you guys.
I probably have the shortest answer, so I'll go first and then I'll let the experts take over. But I mean, obviously this IBA that I'm talking about here is an extreme example. It looks like, to me, the drafting language of what the company maybe sought to secure, and I'm not sure what's in the final agreement, but I would just want to pull back the frame a bit from the IBA itself and ask some questions about the context in which they're negotiated. And as we know, a lot of the deep debate and agony over decision making on non-sustainable resources that have very, very long afterlives that can be quite toxic in communities, such as mines, such as the danger of pipeline spills, such as the destruction of sacred areas and harvest sites and fish spawning sites and so on. The broader context in which IBAs are negotiated, I think, we need to raise questions about whether or not if the financial incentive is the strongest for communities to negotiate, to ask what needs to be put in place in order so that communities don't have to make decisions just based on financial need and can make the decision on whether or not this is actually something within the broader economic development plans for their community makes sense for them. And I feel strongly about that, because I feel like consent isn't just a decision to say yes or no. It's the question about whether or not the community has the capacity to say no when they've had many decades of unemployment, high unemployment in communities, and lack of access to employment opportunities, and lack of access to revenues, especially those not tied very strictly to programs and services and contribution agreement funding and so on, which are very, very narrow and restrictive. So that's my piece about it, is just looking at the broader context of consent, and then the negotiators have much more fine-grained understandings of what that actually looks like in agreements when you're negotiating.
Jacob, do you want to go last? Do you want me to go? Give me the thumbs up. You want me to go?
Go ahead.
Okay. I would just say consent to what, right? So yes, Nikki, it's the case that that sometimes they are not, oftentimes they are not. But let's pull it apart a little bit, because it's they should be if they're properly and well negotiated, they should be consent for a particular project as described and understood. Let's keep that in mind, understood, because people really do have to understand what they are agreeing to. And so impact assessment is absolutely vital to understanding a project. Impact assessment, well played through the new act, will allow us to really understand a project, form it, change it, and make it so that it doesn't impact on what people care about most, right? But so it's consent to the project as described and agreed to by the parties. But keep in mind, there's consent that can't be given by a company. A company's just operating a project. The consent with the federal government is the one we should be thinking about, or the territorial or provincial, because they are the ones who, through granting of mineral leases, are actually alienating land, and therefore making it so that the consent decision that gets given about a project is not in play, right? So a community, an Indigenous government, if they have no control over permitting, over the mineral exploration and leasing moment, then that consent moment has been taken away. It's gone. And so then they're in a place where what's being framed is only consent around a project, and they weren't able to consent about the exploration, the mineral lease, and therefore the mineral production moment is the one that they're talking about. So I think it's really important to take note of that consent moment in Canada still hasn't been very well grappled with. And the NWT, as I said previously, in that legislation, we attempted to, it was imperfect. But I expect that to be the big battle in Canada. And so I will close by saying, look very carefully, stay away from the evil kinds of clauses that Sherry described, because they are not reasonable. But there's a lot of corporate lawyers out there who get them in across the country, and I see them time and time again in agreements across the country. So stay away from them and make sure you cover your bases there, and make sure that you are able to revisit your agreement, because consent is something like, who's in a marriage where you say yes on day 1 and then you don't care in day 15? That's not a marriage anymore, right? Or on year 15. A marriage only works if you're still working at it 15 years later. And if you take a look in the mirror. And so when I say take a look in the mirror, I mean you need to have clauses in your agreement to revisit, to open it up and sit together and say, how are we doing? What do we need to change? Diavik has done that with their agreements. Raglan has done it with their agreements. It can be an onerous process, but it can, up to a year or 2 years. But if it's a long project, you need to be able to take a look at it and at the marriage and spruce it up a little.
Thanks. Well, we're out of time, so I just would like to, Kirby, I don't know if you want to help out, but thank my co-host Kirby Moldo there in Gitxsan territory. And
thank you all. Thanks everybody for participating. Hope you have a great day. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Yeah, and thanks so much, Sherry, Jacob, Ginger. Really appreciate your expertise and really shining a light. We're going to send out, you'll get a quick little survey after this. It would be great to just hear how you appreciated the webinar, and if thoughts on other future topics. We've done one on the UN Declaration. This is our second one that Kirby and I have co-hosted. And also, if you do have any outstanding questions, then maybe when we send out the link to the recording, we can also see if we can answer a couple more of those. But huge thank you. Stay well, everybody, and
take care.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.